I meet Richard Keller on a cold Tuesday morning in March 2024 in the small conference room of my firm on State Street, and the first thing he tells me is that his father died 3 weeks ago and left him a house worth $2,400,000. Except now he can't get inside because the locks have been changed, and his stepsister Maya is living there with her mother, who used to be the housekeeper. Richard sits across from me with a manila folder in his lap, his hands shaking just a little. And he says the mortgage was paid off years ago. The property tax is current, and his father always told him the house would be his when the time came. He's 36, works in IT, drives up from Nashua every day, and he needs to know if he has to go to probate court or if there's a faster way to claim what's his. I ask him to start from the beginning, and he takes a breath and explains that his father, Douglas Keller, was 68 when he died of a heart attack on the 4th of February, that Douglas had been married to Richard's mother until she passed away from cancer in 2012, and that Douglas never remarried but employed a woman named Carmen Voss as a live-in housekeeper starting in 2014. Richard says he visited his father maybe once a month, that the house is a 4-bedroom colonial in Bedford with a detached garage and nearly 2 acres of land, and that Carmen's daughter Maya, who's 22 now, moved in around 2018 when she started community college. He says he always got along fine with both of them, that his father seemed happy, and that he had no reason to think anything was wrong until he showed up the day after the funeral and found the locks changed and Carmen standing in the doorway telling him he needed to leave. I write all of this down in my yellow pad, and then I ask Richard if his father left a will, and he says he doesn't know, that his father never talked about it, and that he assumed everything would just pass to him as the only child. I ask if there are any other siblings, and he says no, just him. Though technically Maya is his stepsister now that he thinks about it, even though Douglas never formally adopted her. I ask if Douglas had any significant assets beyond the house, and Richard blinks and says yes. Actually, his father made a fortune in crypto, that he got in early on Bitcoin and Ethereum and a bunch of other coins, that he was always talking about his crypto wallet and private keys and how he kept everything offline in cold storage because he didn't trust the exchange accounts. I feel a small pulse of adrenaline because estate cases involving cryptocurrency are messy, the kind of mess that can drag on for years if the keys are lost or disputed. And I ask Richard if he has any idea how much his father held in crypto. Richard says he doesn't know the exact number, but his father once mentioned it was worth more than the house, maybe $3 or $4 million, maybe more depending on the market. I ask if Douglas kept any records, and Richard says his father was obsessive about documentation, that he kept everything in a safe deposit box at the bank downtown, and that Richard has a key because Douglas gave it to him years ago in case anything ever happened. That detail matters, and I make a note to get access to that box as soon as possible. But first I need to understand the legal landscape. I ask Richard if he's searched the house for a will, and he says he hasn't been inside since the locks were changed. I ask if he's checked with his father's attorney, and he says he didn't know his father had one. I ask if he's filed anything with the probate court yet, and he says, no, he came to me first because his friend recommended me and said I was good at complicated family stuff. I tell him that was smart, that we need to move carefully, and that the first step is to figure out whether Douglas left a will and what it says. I explain to Richard that in New Hampshire, if someone dies without a will, what we call dying intestate, the estate gets divided according to a statutory formula, and if Douglas had no spouse and one child, then Richard would inherit everything. But if there's a will, then we're bound by whatever Douglas wrote, assuming the will is valid and wasn't made under duress or undue influence. Richard asks what happens if Maya or Carmen try to claim that Douglas promised them something. And I tell him that oral promises generally don't hold up in probate, that we need written evidence, but that if Carmen can show she had a long-term relationship with Douglas, she might try to argue for a share as a domestic partner, depending on how the state law shakes out. Richard looks pale and asks if that means he could lose the house, and I tell him honestly that I don't know yet, that everything depends on whether there's a will and what it says, and that our job right now is to find out. I ask him if he has access to his father's email account or phone, and he says no, that Carmen took the phone and he doesn't know the password for the email. I tell him we'll subpoena those records if we need to. But first, let's go to the bank and open that safe deposit box and see what we find. We schedule a trip to the bank for the next morning, and I tell Richard to bring his ID. His father's death certificate and the key. He nods and stands to leave, then pauses at the door and asks me how much this is going to cost. I tell him my retainer is $5,000 and that I bill at $350 an hour, but that if we settle quickly, it might only run another $2,000 or $3,000. And if we end up in a trial, it could be $20,000 or $30,000 or more. He swallows hard and says he has the retainer in savings, that he'll wire transfer it this afternoon, and that he just wants this over with so he can move on. I shake his hand and tell him we'll do our best. After Richard leaves, I sit at my desk and pull up the New Hampshire probate statutes on my computer, reviewing the rules for intestate succession and the requirements for a valid will. I've handled a dozen estate cases in the past 5 years, but none with this much money at stake and none involving crypto, which is still a gray area in a lot of jurisdictions. I make a note to research how courts have treated cryptocurrency in estate disputes, whether it's considered property or something else, and how we prove ownership if the private keys are stored offline. I also make a note to check if Douglas filed any trust documents, because wealthy people often use trusts to avoid probate. And if there's a trust, then the house and the crypto might not even be part of the estate. The next morning, Wednesday the 12th of March, I meet Richard at the bank at 9:30 a.m., and we sit in a small windowless room while a clerk brings us the safe deposit box. Richard uses his key and the clerk uses the bank's key, and the box opens to reveal a stack of papers, a USB drive, and a sealed envelope with last will and testament written on the front in neat blue ink. Richard exhales loudly and reaches for the envelope, but I stop him and say we should photograph everything first. So I take out my phone and snap pictures of the box contents from multiple angles before we touch anything. I put on a pair of latex gloves, habit from my prosecutor days, and carefully remove the envelope. It's not sealed with wax or notarized on the outside, just a standard business envelope. And I open it and pull out a 3-page document dated the 18th of November, 2023, just a few months before Douglas died. The first page has a header that reads, "Last Will and Testament of Douglas Raymond Keller," and below that, a paragraph stating that Douglas is of sound mind and body, that he revokes all prior wills, and that he appoints his daughter Maya Celeste Voss as the executor of his estate. I read that line twice, then look up at Richard, whose face has gone completely white. I keep reading. The second page lays out the distribution, 80% of the estate, including all real property, financial accounts, and digital assets to Maya Celeste Voss, 10% to Richard Andrew Keller, and 10% to Carmen Lucia Voss to be held in trust until her 70th birthday. The document defines digital assets to include all cryptocurrency held in any wallet or account, all private keys and seed phrases, and all related documentation. It's signed by Douglas at the bottom, and witnessed by 2 people whose names I don't recognize, a Linda Tran and a Robert Coelho, with addresses in Manchester. Richard grabs the document from my hands and stares at it, his mouth opening and closing, and finally he says that this can't be real, that his father would never do this, that Maya isn't even his real daughter. I ask him what he means by real daughter, and he stammers that Maya is Carmen's child, that she has a different last name, that Douglas never adopted her. I point to the word daughter in the will and say that the document itself calls her that, which suggests something we need to investigate. And I ask Richard if it's possible that Douglas is actually Maya's biological father. Richard stares at me like I just slapped him. He says no, absolutely not, that Maya's father was some guy Carmen was with before she came to work for Douglas, that his father never mentioned anything like that. I say okay, but we need to verify, because if Douglas believed Maya was his daughter, or if she actually is his daughter, then that changes everything about how we approach this case. Richard shakes his head and says, "This is insane, that his father wouldn't lie to him for 10 years, that there has to be another explanation." I tell him that people keep secrets for all kinds of reasons, especially when it comes to money and family, and that our job now is to find out the truth. I bag the will and the other documents, including what looks like a trust agreement and several bank statements, and I take the USB drive as well. Richard is silent on the walk back to my car, and when we get in, he finally asks what happens next. I tell him that we need to authenticate the will, which means tracking down the witnesses and confirming that Douglas signed it voluntarily, and that we also need to investigate the relationship between Douglas and Carmen to see if Maya is in fact his biological child. I say that if the will is valid and Maya is his daughter, then the distribution is probably going to stand. But if we can show that Douglas was coerced or unduly influenced by Carmen, or if the will wasn't properly executed, then we might be able to challenge it. Richard asks how we find out if Maya is Douglas's daughter, and I tell him that the cleanest way is a DNA test, that we can petition the court to order one if Maya won't agree voluntarily. He asks what we do if she refuses, and I say we can try to find medical records, birth certificates, anything that might indicate paternity, but DNA is the gold standard. He asks how long all of this takes, and I tell him honestly that probate cases can take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on how contested they are, and that if we go to trial over the will's validity, it could be even longer. He drops his head into his hands and says he can't afford 2 years of legal bills, and I tell him that we'll do everything we can to resolve this quickly, but that he needs to be prepared for a fight. Back at my office, I spend the afternoon reviewing the trust agreement, which is a standard revocable living trust dated the same day as the will, naming Maya as the primary beneficiary and Richard and Carmen as secondary beneficiaries with the same percentage split. The trust holds title to the house, which means the house doesn't go through probate, it just transfers directly to Maya as the trustee. That's a problem for Richard because it means he can't contest the house transfer in probate court. He'd have to file a separate lawsuit to challenge the trust, arguing either that it was invalid from the start or that Douglas lacked capacity when he created it. I also review the bank statements, which show that Douglas had 3 checking accounts, 2 savings accounts, and a brokerage account with a combined balance of around $800,000 as of January 2024. The statements show regular deposits from Social Security and from some kind of consulting work, and regular withdrawals for household expenses, utilities, and property tax. There are also several large transfers to an account at a cryptocurrency exchange called Kraken, totaling about $200,000 over the past year, which suggests Douglas was still actively buying crypto right up until he died. The USB drive is encrypted, and when I try to open it on my computer, it asks for a password. I make a note to hire a forensic IT specialist to crack it, because if the drive contains the private keys to Douglas's crypto wallets, then whoever controls those keys controls the crypto. And we need to make sure Maya doesn't transfer everything out of the country before we can get a court order freezing the assets. I draft a quick motion for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction, asking the court to prevent Maya from accessing or transferring any of the estate assets until we can sort out the validity of the will. And I plan to file it first thing tomorrow morning. That evening, I get a call from Richard asking if I've learned anything new, and I tell him about the trust and the encrypted USB drive. He asks if we can just go to the house and confront Maya and Carmen, demand to see the private keys, and I tell him absolutely not, that any contact with them needs to go through me, and that if he shows up at the house, he could be arrested for trespassing or harassment. He says he just wants to talk to them, to understand why his father did this, and I tell him I understand, but that we need to be strategic. I promise to reach out to Maya's attorney, assuming she has one, and see if we can set up a meeting to discuss the situation. I hang up and immediately start drafting a letter to Carmen and Maya, introducing myself as Richard's attorney and requesting that they preserve all documents related to Douglas's estate, including any computers, phones, or storage devices that might contain financial records or communications. I also request that they not access or transfer any cryptocurrency or other digital assets until the estate is properly administered. I send the letter via certified mail and email to the address on file for the house, and I copy Richard on the email so he knows I'm taking action. Thursday morning, I'm in court by 8:30 a.m. to file the motion for a temporary restraining order. And I get lucky because Judge Patricia Moreno is on the bench, and she's known for being fair and fast. I explained to her that we have a contested estate with significant cryptocurrency holdings, that the decedent's will leaves 80% to a person who may or may not be his biological daughter, and that we need to freeze the assets to prevent dissipation while we sort out the facts. The judge asks if I've notified the other parties, and I say yes, that I sent a letter yesterday, and that I'm requesting an emergency hearing for tomorrow to give them a chance to respond. Judge Moreno grants the temporary restraining order, effective immediately, and schedules a hearing for Friday at 2 p.m. She signs the order, and I take it straight to the clerk's office to get it entered into the system. Then I email a copy to the address I have for Carmen and Maya and to Richard. I also call Richard and tell him the good news, that the assets are frozen for now, and he sounds relieved but also anxious, asking what happens at the hearing tomorrow. I tell him that Maya will probably show up with an attorney, that they'll argue the will is valid and should be enforced, and that we'll argue we need time to investigate whether the will was procured by undue influence or fraud. I tell him to dress professionally, to stay calm, and to let me do the talking. Friday afternoon, the courtroom is half full, and I see Maya for the first time sitting in the front row with Carmen and an attorney I recognize named David Park, who does a lot of estate work in the area. Maya is small and dark-haired, wearing a black dress and minimal makeup, and she looks nervous. Carmen is older, maybe mid-50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a bun, and she sits with her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. David Park is in his late 40s, balding, with a crisp navy suit and a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my car. Judge Moreno calls the case and asks me to summarize the issue. I stand and explain that Douglas Keller died on the 4th of February, leaving an estate valued at over $6 million, including a house held in trust, significant bank accounts, and cryptocurrency assets. I explain that the will executed in November 2023 leaves 80% to Maya Voss, who was Douglas's housekeeper's daughter, and only 10% to Richard, Douglas's acknowledged son. I say that we have concerns about whether the will was procured through undue influence, given that Maya and Carmen lived with Douglas and had daily access to him, and that we also have questions about the biological relationship between Douglas and Maya that need to be resolved before the will can be admitted to probate. David Park stands and argues that the will is facially valid, that it was witnessed by two disinterested parties, that Douglas was of sound mind when he signed it, and that there's no evidence of undue influence. He says that Maya is in fact Douglas's biological daughter, that Douglas privately acknowledged paternity years ago, and that the will simply reflects Douglas's desire to provide for the daughter he loved and who cared for him in his final years. He says that Richard had minimal contact with his father, visiting only once a month, and that Douglas was free to dispose of his property as he saw fit. I object and say that we've received no documentation of this alleged paternity, no birth certificate listing Douglas as the father, no DNA test, no formal acknowledgement. Judge Moreno asks David Park if he has any evidence of paternity, and he says that Maya has a letter from Douglas, handwritten and dated, in which Douglas acknowledges that Maya is his daughter and explains that he kept it secret to protect Richard's feelings after Richard's mother died. The judge asks to see the letter, and David hands her a photocopy. Judge Moreno reads the letter in silence for about 30 seconds, then looks up and asks me if I want to review it. I say yes, and she hands it to me. The letter is dated the 3rd of June, 2019, and it's addressed to Maya. It reads, "My dear Maya, I want you to know that you are my daughter, that I loved your mother from the moment we met, and that I have loved you since the day you were born. I could not acknowledge you publicly because of my marriage, and because I did not want to hurt Richard, but I have always considered you my child, and I have provided for you in every way I could. When the time comes, I will make sure you are taken care of. I hope you can forgive me for not being the father you deserved. Love, Dad." I read it twice, my mind racing, and then I say to the judge that this letter, if authentic, raises more questions than it answers, including why Douglas waited until 2019 to tell Maya when she was born in 2003, and why he never amended Richard's birth certificate or any legal documents to reflect Maya's status. I say that we need a DNA test to confirm paternity, and that we need to investigate when and how Carmen and Douglas began their relationship. Because if Maya was born in 2003 and Carmen didn't start working for Douglas until 2014, then the timeline doesn't add up. David Park interrupts and says that Carmen and Douglas met in 2002, that Carmen worked for Douglas's business as a bookkeeper before she became his housekeeper, and that their relationship began shortly after Richard's mother was diagnosed with cancer. He says that Douglas supported Carmen and Maya financially for years, paying for Maya's education and living expenses, and that when Carmen moved into the house in 2014, it was simply a formalization of an existing relationship. He says that all of this can be documented with bank records, emails, and witness testimony. Judge Moreno holds up her hand and says that this is clearly a complicated case that's going to require discovery and possibly a trial, but that for now, she's going to extend the temporary restraining order and order both parties to preserve all evidence. including the USB drive, all computers and phones, and all financial records. She also orders Maya to submit to a DNA test within 30 days, using a court-approved lab, with the results to be filed under seal. She says that if Maya refuses, the court will draw an adverse inference, meaning we can assume Douglas is not her biological father. David Park starts to object, but Maya touches his arm and whispers something, and he nods and says that Maya will comply. The hearing ends and we file out of the courtroom. Richard looks shell-shocked and asks me what just happened, and I tell him that we got the DNA test, which is huge, and that we bought ourselves time to investigate. I also tell him that the letter is a problem, that even if it's not dispositive, it suggests Douglas intended Maya to inherit, and that we're going to have to work hard to find evidence of undue influence or lack of capacity. Richard asks what that means, and I say we need to find people who interacted with Douglas in the months before he died, people who can testify about his mental state, whether he seemed confused or forgetful, whether Carmen was controlling his access to information or isolating him from friends and family. Over the next 2 weeks, I throw myself into discovery. I subpoena Douglas's medical records from his primary care physician and find that he was diagnosed with early-stage dementia in October 2023, just a month before he signed the will. The doctor's notes say that Douglas showed mild cognitive impairment, memory lapses, and difficulty with complex tasks, but that he was still capable of making decisions about his daily life. That's not enough to prove lack of capacity. The legal standard is whether he understood the nature and extent of his property and the natural objects of his bounty, but it's a start. I also subpoena Douglas's phone records and email account, and I spend hours combing through them looking for any sign of coercion or manipulation. What I find instead is a consistent pattern of affectionate communication between Douglas and Maya, with Douglas sending her money via Venmo and PayPal, checking in on her classes, and offering advice about her future. There are also frequent texts between Douglas and Carmen, discussing household matters, medication schedules, and doctor's appointments. The tone is intimate and domestic, the kind of communication you'd expect between a long-term couple. I interview the two witnesses to the will, Linda Tran and Robert Coelho, and both of them tell me the same story, that they met Douglas at a coffee shop in Manchester, where he asked them to witness his will, that he seemed alert and coherent, that he read the will aloud to them before signing, and that he specifically said he wanted to make sure Maya was taken care of because she was his daughter and Richard already had a good job and didn't need the money. Linda even remembers Douglas joking that Richard would be mad at first, but would understand eventually. Neither of them recall any indication that Douglas was confused or being pressured. The DNA results come back on the 5th of April, and they confirm with 99.9% certainty that Douglas Keller was Maya Voss's biological father. I call Richard and tell him, and there's a long silence on the other end of the line before he says he doesn't believe it, that there must be a mistake. I tell him that DNA tests are extremely reliable, that the lab used is accredited and court-approved, and that we have to accept this as fact. He asks me what it means for the case, and I tell him honestly that it makes our job much harder, because now Maya isn't just some random person who lived with Douglas, she's his daughter. And courts are very reluctant to second-guess a parent's decision to leave property to their child. Richard asks if we can still challenge the will on the basis of undue influence, and I tell him yes, but that the bar is high. We need to show that Carmen or Maya exerted pressure on Douglas, that he was susceptible to that pressure because of his dementia, and that the will reflects their desires rather than his. I tell him that the dementia diagnosis helps, but it's not enough by itself, because the doctor said Douglas was still competent to make decisions. We need more. We need witnesses who saw Carmen isolating Douglas, preventing him from seeing Richard, or coaching him on what to say or do. I put out feelers to Douglas's neighbors, former colleagues, and friends, and I eventually find a woman named Janet Yee who lives 2 houses down from the Keller property. Janet tells me that she used to have coffee with Douglas every few months, that he would walk over and chat about the neighborhood, but that in the last year of his life, she barely saw him. She says that when she did see him, usually when he was getting the mail, he seemed distracted and tired, and that Carmen was always hovering nearby. Janet says she tried to invite Douglas over for Thanksgiving in 2023, but Carmen answered the door and said Douglas wasn't feeling well and needed to rest. Janet says she thought it was odd but didn't push it. I also tracked down a former colleague of Douglas named Martin Rizzo, who worked with him on a consulting project in 2022. Martin tells me that Douglas was sharp as ever back then, that they worked together on a complex software architecture problem, but that when Martin reached out in late 2023 to ask Douglas to review a proposal, Douglas didn't respond to emails or phone calls. Martin says he assumed Douglas was busy or retired, but now he wonders if something else was going on. I depose Carmen in late April, and she's calm and articulate, denying any suggestion that she controlled Douglas's access to information or influenced his decisions about the will. She testifies that she and Douglas fell in love in 2002, that Maya was conceived during a difficult time in Douglas's marriage, and that Douglas asked her to keep the relationship secret to avoid hurting Richard's mother, who was undergoing chemotherapy. She says that Douglas supported her and Maya financially for years, that he was an involved father who paid for Maya's private school and college, and that when Carmen moved into the house in 2014, it was because Douglas wanted them to be a family. Carmen also testifies that Douglas's dementia was mild, that he was still fully capable of managing his finances and making decisions about his estate, and that the will was entirely his idea. She says that Douglas told her in November 2023 that he wanted to make sure Maya was taken care of, that Richard had a good career and didn't need the money, and that he felt guilty for not acknowledging Maya publicly during his lifetime. She says that Douglas asked her to help him find witnesses for the will, and that she drove him to the coffee shop in Manchester where he met Linda and Robert. I asked Carmen about the USB drive and the cryptocurrency, and she says that Douglas told her it contained his private keys and seed phrases, but that he kept the password to himself and she doesn't have access. She says that Douglas mentioned the crypto was worth several $1,000,000, but that she doesn't know the exact amount or which wallets he used. I ask her if Douglas gave Maya or her any instructions about accessing the crypto after his death, and she says no, that Douglas said everything would be handled by the executor according to the will. I depose Maya separately, and she's more emotional than her mother, crying several times during the questioning. She testifies that she always knew Douglas was her father, that he told her when she was 10 years old, and that she loved him even though their relationship had to be secret. She says that Douglas was kind and generous, that he helped her with homework, that he attended her high school graduation in disguise, wearing sunglasses and a hat, and that he paid for her to attend community college and later the University of New Hampshire. She says that Richard knew about her but never seemed to care, that he barely visited and didn't spend time with Douglas even when he did. Maya also testifies that in the months before Douglas died, he became forgetful and sometimes confused, but that he was clear about wanting her to inherit the house and the majority of the estate. She says that Douglas told her he felt he had failed her by not acknowledging her publicly, and that the will was his way of making amends. She says that she never asked Douglas for money or property, that her mother never pressured him, and that everything in the will was Douglas's choice. After the depositions, I sit down with Richard and go over what we've learned. I tell him that the case is not going well, that we have the dementia diagnosis but no real evidence that Carmen or Maya manipulated Douglas, and that the DNA test and the letter both support the conclusion that Douglas wanted Maya to inherit. Richard is frustrated and says that none of this makes sense, that his father loved him and wouldn't have cut him out of the estate, and that there has to be something we're missing. I tell Richard that I think we need to focus on the USB drive, that if we can crack it and access the private keys, we might be able to show that Douglas's crypto holdings are even larger than we thought, which could make the 10% share he left to Richard worth more in absolute terms. Richard says he doesn't care about the absolute amount, that he wants the house, that it's his childhood home, and it should be his. I tell him gently that the house is in the trust and that Maya is the trustee, and that unless we can prove the trust was invalid, he's not going to get the house. Richard stands up and paces around my office, his hands in his pockets, and finally he says he wants to settle, that he can't afford to keep fighting, that the legal bills are already over $15,000 and he's maxed out his credit cards. I tell him that I understand that litigation is expensive and that maybe we can negotiate a better deal than the 10% in the will. He asks how much I think we can get, and I tell him honestly that it depends on whether Maya and Carmen want to avoid a trial, but that I could probably get him 15 or 20% if I present it as a way to avoid years of litigation and the risk that a jury might find undue influence. reach out to David Park and propose a settlement conference, and he agrees to meet the following week. On the 10th of May, 2024, we gather in a conference room at a neutral law office, with me and Richard on one side of the table and David, Maya, and Carmen on the other. I open by saying that we all want to avoid a lengthy trial, that Douglas clearly loved both Richard and Maya, and that the fairest outcome is one that reflects that love while respecting his wishes. I propose that Richard receive 25% of the estate, including a life estate in the house, meaning he can live there until he dies or chooses to leave, at which point it reverts to Maya. David listens and then counters that the will is clear and should be enforced as written, but that in the interest of family harmony, Maya is willing to increase Richard's share to 15% and give him the option to purchase the house at fair market value, with the purchase price deducted from his inheritance. I do the math in my head and realize that even at 15%, Richard would get about $900,000, which is not enough to buy the house outright, even with the deduction. So he'd still need a mortgage and he'd be paying interest on a loan for a house his father owned free and clear. I look at Richard and he shakes his head. So I counter again, proposing 20% and the right to live in the house for 2 years rent-free while he figures out his next steps. David confers with Maya and Carmen, and Maya says softly that she's willing to do that, but only if Richard agrees not to contest the will or the trust in court. I say that's acceptable as long as Richard also gets access to all of Douglas's financial records and the decrypted contents of the USB drive so that he can verify the total value of the estate. David agrees to that, and we spend the next hour hammering out the details of the settlement agreement. Richard will receive 20% of the estate, valued at approximately $1,280,000 based on current crypto prices and the bank account balances. He will have the right to live in the house rent-free for 2 years, after which he must vacate, and the house will belong solely to Maya. Carmen will receive her 10% as specified in the will to be held in trust. Maya will serve as executor and will be responsible for liquidating the cryptocurrency and distributing the funds within 6 months. Richard signs the agreement with a shaky hand, and I witness his signature along with David. Maya and Carmen sign as well, and then we all shake hands awkwardly and leave. In the elevator, Richard turns to me and says he feels like he sold out his father's memory, and I tell him that he made a smart decision, that he avoided years of legal fees and uncertainty, and that he's walking away with over $1 million and a place to live while he sorts out his life. The next few weeks are spent working with David to identify and value Douglas's cryptocurrency holdings. The IT specialist I hired manages to crack the USB drive, and we find that Douglas held wallets on 3 different blockchains: Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a smaller coin called Cardano. The total value as of mid-May 2024 is approximately $5,800,000, which is higher than we estimated. There are also detailed spreadsheets showing Douglas's purchase history, his cost basis, and his long-term strategy, which was to hold everything and never sell. Maya, acting as executor, works with a cryptocurrency exchange to liquidate the holdings in tranches to minimize market impact. And by the end of June, the entire estate has been converted to US dollars and deposited into an estate account. After paying estate taxes, legal fees, and other administrative costs, the net distributable estate is approximately $4,900,000. Richard receives his 20%, which comes out to $980,000, wired to his bank account on the 30th of June. Carmen's 10%, $490,000, is placed in a trust account to be managed by a professional trustee until she turns 70. Maya receives the remaining 70%, $3,430,000, plus the house and all of Douglas's personal property. She pays off her student loans, buys a new car, and sets up a college fund for her future children. She also donates $50,000 to a dementia research charity in Douglas's name, which I learn about when she sends me a thank you card with a copy of the receipt. Richard moves into the house in July and tells me that it feels strange to be there, that he keeps expecting his father to walk in from the garage or call him down for dinner. He says he's been going through Douglas's things, finding old photos, reading letters, and trying to understand who his father really was. He says he found a journal that Douglas kept in the last year of his life, and that in it Douglas wrote about his regret at keeping Maya a secret. His fear that he had damaged his relationship with Richard beyond repair, and his hope that someday both of his children would understand that he loved them equally. Richard says he wishes he had known about Maya earlier, that he would have liked to have a sister, and that he feels angry at his father for lying, but also sad that they never got to have an honest conversation about it. He asks me if I think Douglas did the right thing, and I tell him that I don't know, that family law is full of complicated choices, and that people do the best they can with the information and emotional resources they have. I tell him that Douglas provided for him, that $1 million is a life-changing amount of money, and that he has 2 years to figure out what he wants to do next. In August, Richard tells me he's thinking about reaching out to Maya, that he wants to understand her perspective and maybe start building some kind of relationship. I tell him that sounds healthy, that it takes courage to do that after everything that's happened, and that maybe it's what Douglas would have wanted. Richard nods slowly and says he's not sure what he'll say to her, but that he feels like he owes it to both of them to try. I give him Maya's phone number, which I got from David Park during the settlement process, and I wish him luck. A few weeks later, Richard calls me and says he met Maya for coffee, that they talked for 3 hours, and that it was awkward at first, but then got easier. He says Maya apologized for the way things went down, that she never wanted to take anything from him, and that she was just as shocked as he was when Douglas died and the will came out. He says they talked about their father, about the choices he made, about the secrets he kept, and about what it means to be siblings when they barely know each other. Richard says he's planning to see her again next week, maybe for dinner, and that Carmen might join them. I tell Richard I'm glad to hear that. That family is complicated but worth fighting for, and that I hope he and Maya can build something good out of this difficult situation. He thanks me again for my work and says that even though the case didn't turn out the way he hoped, he feels like he got something more valuable than the house. He got a sister and a chance to understand his father better. I tell him that's a beautiful way to look at it, and that I'm honored to have played a small part in his journey. Over the next few months, I check in with Richard periodically, and each time he sounds more at peace with how things turned out. He tells me that he and Maya have dinner together every few weeks, that Carmen joined them a couple of times and that it was surprisingly comfortable, and that they've started sharing stories about Douglas and filling in the gaps in each other's knowledge. Richard says he learned that Douglas attended Maya's dance recitals in disguise, that he helped her pick out a car when she turned 18, and that he wrote her long emails about life and philosophy that she still has saved. Maya tells Richard stories too, about how Douglas talked about his son with pride, how he kept photos of Richard on his desk in the study, how he worried that Richard was working too hard and not taking care of himself. She tells him that Douglas felt tremendous guilt about the situation, that he wanted to tell Richard the truth but never found the courage, and that the will was his way of trying to make things right, even though it ended up causing more pain. Richard says hearing all of this helps him forgive his father, helps him see that Douglas was just a flawed human being trying to navigate an impossible situation. In September, Richard tells me he's decided not to stay in the house for the full 2 years, that being there reminds him too much of what he lost and what he never had. He says he's found a condo in Portsmouth that he likes, a 2-bedroom with a view of the water, and that he's going to use part of his inheritance for the down payment. He asked me to review the purchase agreement, and I do, making a few minor suggestions. And then he closes on the property in early October. Richard invites me to his housewarming party in late October, and I'm surprised to find Maya and Carmen there among the other guests. Maya gives Richard a framed photo of Douglas as a housewarming gift, and Richard hangs it in the living room where everyone can see it. Carmen brings homemade empanadas and tells stories about Douglas that make everyone laugh. Stories about his terrible singing voice and his obsession with obscure cryptocurrency, projects, and his habit of leaving Post-it notes all over the house with reminders to himself. I watch Richard and Maya standing side by side in the kitchen, talking and laughing, and I think about how far they've come since that first hearing in March. I think about how the law brought them together in conflict, but how they chose to use that conflict as a starting point for something better. I think about how Douglas's death and his complicated will forced them to confront truths they might have avoided forever, and how those truths, as painful as they were, ultimately gave them a gift: each other. Before I leave the party, Maya pulls me aside and thanks me for everything I did. She says she knows I was representing Richard and that my job was to fight for his interests, but that she appreciates the way I handled the case with respect and dignity. She says that in a different world, with different attorneys, this could have turned into a years-long battle that destroyed any chance of her and Richard having a relationship. She says she's grateful that didn't happen, and she asks if she can give me a hug. I say yes, and we embrace briefly before she goes back to the party. In November, Richard calls me with an interesting proposal. He says that he and Maya have been talking about Douglas's legacy and what they want to do with the money they inherited. He says they're both doing well financially now, that neither of them needs millions of dollars to be happy, and that they want to create a scholarship fund in Douglas's name for students studying computer science or cryptography. He asks if I can help them set up a charitable foundation, and I tell him I can, that I'll need to bring in a nonprofit specialist, but that I'd be honored to be part of the project. Over the next few months, I work with Richard, Maya, and a nonprofit attorney named Sarah Chen to create the Douglas Keller Memorial Scholarship Fund. Richard and Maya each contribute $250,000 as seed money, and they recruit Carmen to serve on the board of directors, along with a few of Douglas's former colleagues and friends. The fund will award scholarships of $10,000 each year to deserving students, with a preference for first-generation college students and students from low-income backgrounds. The first scholarship awards are announced in April 2025, and Richard and Maya attend the ceremony together. 4 students receive awards, and each of them gives a short speech about their goals and their gratitude. One of the students, a young woman named Priya who's studying blockchain technology, says that the scholarship is life-changing, that it means she won't have to work 2 jobs while going to school, and that she's honored to carry on Douglas Keller's legacy of innovation and generosity. After the ceremony, I talked to Richard and Maya, and they both seemed genuinely happy, the kind of happiness that comes from doing something meaningful with resources you didn't expect to have. Richard tells me that creating the scholarship fund has helped him make peace with Douglas's choices, that he sees now that his father's wealth wasn't just about accumulation, but about creating opportunities for others. Maya agrees and says that she thinks Douglas would be proud of what they're doing, that it honors both his love of technology and his desire to help people succeed. In the months that follow, I stay in touch with Richard and Maya, checking in occasionally to see how they're doing. Richard's consulting business is thriving, and he's hired 2 employees and is considering expanding into a larger office space. Maya has finished her graduate program in social work and has started working at a nonprofit that helps families navigate the probate system, which she says feels like a fitting career given her own experience. Carmen has retired from housekeeping and spends her time volunteering at a community center and babysitting for Maya's neighbors, the house in Bedford. The one that started this whole legal battle is now rented to a family with 3 young children who love the big backyard and the quiet neighborhood. Maya uses the rental income to maintain the property and to make improvements, and she said that she'll probably keep it as a rental for the foreseeable future rather than selling it. Richard visits occasionally to help with repairs or to walk through the rooms where he grew up, and he says it doesn't hurt as much anymore, that the house has become just a house rather than a symbol of everything he lost. One afternoon in June 2025, I'm sitting in my office reviewing a new case when I get an email from Richard with the subject line, "Thank you." I open it and find a long message reflecting on the past year and a half, on everything that's happened since his father died, and he walked into my office that cold March morning. He writes that he's grateful for my guidance and my advocacy, that I helped him navigate the most difficult period of his life with professionalism and compassion. He writes that he's also grateful for the outcome, even though it wasn't what he initially wanted, because it led him to Maya and to a deeper understanding of his father. Richard writes that he's learned something important. Through this experience, that family isn't just about blood or legal relationships or who gets what in a will. It's about the choices we make, the connections we nurture, the forgiveness we extend, and the legacies we create. He writes that Douglas made mistakes, kept secrets, and caused pain, but that he also loved deeply and provided generously and tried in his own flawed way to do right by everyone. He writes that he's trying to honor that complexity, to see his father as a whole person rather than as a hero or a villain. He ends the email by saying that he and Maya are planning a trip to visit Douglas's grave together, that they're going to bring flowers and maybe have a picnic nearby and tell stories about their dad. He says he wishes Douglas could see them now, see how they found their way to each other despite everything. But that maybe in some way he does. He thanks me one more time for everything, signs off with warmth, and includes a photo of him and Maya standing together in front of the Bedford house, both of them smiling. I sit back in my chair and reread the email twice, feeling that particular mix of professional satisfaction and personal emotion that comes from knowing you've helped someone through a genuinely difficult time. I think about that first meeting with Richard, how lost and angry he was, how certain he was that the will must be invalid, how impossible it seemed that he could ever have a relationship with Maya. I think about the DNA test, the depositions, the settlement negotiations, all the legal machinery we deployed to resolve a fundamentally human problem, and I think about what happened after the legal work was done, after the assets were divided and the paperwork was filed and everyone went home. I think about the choices Richard and Maya made, to reach out, to listen, to forgive, to build something new out of the ruins of their father's complicated life. I think about how the law can create the space for those choices, but can't make them happen. About how my job is to advocate and negotiate and protect my client's interests, but also to recognize when the best outcome might not be the one my client initially wanted. I draft a reply to Richard, keeping it brief and professional but warm. I tell him I'm proud of him and Maya, that I'm honored to have been part of their journey, and that I hope they find peace at Douglas's grave. I tell him that their scholarship fund is a beautiful legacy, and that I'm sure Douglas would be proud. I wish him well in his business and his relationship with Maya, and I let him know that my door is always open if he ever needs anything. I hit send, and then I sit quietly for a moment, thinking about the strange and unpredictable ways that grief and conflict can transform into connection and healing. Later that week, I'm having lunch with Sarah Chen, the nonprofit attorney who helped set up the scholarship fund, and she asks me how the Keller case turned out. I tell her the story, the surprise will, the DNA test, the settlement, the reconciliation, the scholarship fund, and she listens with the kind of focused attention that good lawyers bring to complex narratives. When I finish, she's quiet for a moment, and then she says that it sounds like one of those rare cases where everyone won in the end. Even if they didn't win what they thought they wanted, I nod and say, yes, that's exactly right. That Richard didn't get the house or the 80% share he initially hoped for, but that he got something more valuable, $1 million, a sister, and a new understanding of his father. I say that Maya got to honor her father's wishes and build a relationship with her brother, and that Carmen got financial security and the satisfaction of seeing her daughter and stepson come together. I say that even Douglas, in a way, got what he wanted. His children found each other and created something meaningful in his name. Sarah asks me how often that happens. How often contested estate cases end with reconciliation and charity rather than bitterness and permanent estrangement? I tell her honestly that it's rare, that most of the time people dig in and fight and never speak to each other again. I tell her that I think what made the difference in the Keller case was that Richard and Maya were both fundamentally decent people who were willing to look beyond their own hurt and anger, and that they were lucky to have attorneys who understood that the goal wasn't total victory, but a livable resolution. I also tell Sarah that timing mattered, that Richard ran out of money and patience before he ran out of fight, and that sometimes financial pressure can be a blessing in disguise, because it forces people to be realistic about their options. I tell her that the DNA test helped too, because it gave everyone a clear answer to a factual question and removed one source of uncertainty and speculation. And I tell her that the scholarship fund was brilliant, that it gave Richard and Maya a shared project that allowed them to channel their inheritance into something positive and forward-looking rather than dwelling on the past. Sarah nods thoughtfully and says that it sounds like I did good work on the case, that I balanced advocacy with pragmatism and helped my client see the bigger picture. I thank her, but say that Richard deserves most of the credit, that he was the one who made the hard choices, who reached out to Maya when he could have just taken his money and walked away, who chose forgiveness over resentment. I say that my job is to give clients the information and options they need to make those choices, but that ultimately the choice is theirs. In July, I run into David Park at a continuing legal education seminar, and we grab coffee during the break. He asks about Richard, and I tell him that he's doing well, that he and Maya are close now, and that they created a scholarship fund together. David smiles and says he's not surprised, that he could tell during the settlement negotiations that there was something redeemable in the situation, some possibility of connection beneath all the conflict. He says that Maya talks about Richard all the time now, that she's grateful to have a brother, and that she said more than once that the lawsuit was one of the best things that ever happened to her because it forced them to confront the truth. I tell David that I'm glad it worked out, that I was worried for a while that we'd end up in a nasty trial that would destroy any chance of Richard and Maya having a relationship. He agrees and says that he was worried about the same thing, that he pushed Maya early on to consider settling not just because it made financial sense, but because he could see that she wanted a relationship with Richard, even if she didn't quite know how to ask for it. He says that the settlement gave them both an excuse to stop fighting and start talking, and that sometimes that's all people need. Permission to let go of their anger and try something different. We talk for a few more minutes about other cases, about the challenges of estate litigation, about the ways that family dynamics complicate even straightforward legal questions. And then the seminar is starting again, and we have to go back inside. But before we part ways, David says something that stays with me. He says that the Keller case reminded him why he became a lawyer, that underneath all the paperwork and procedure and advocacy, the law is really about helping people navigate transitions, from life to death, from conflict to resolution, from one chapter to the next. He says that when we do it right, we don't just divide assets or enforce contracts, we help people find their way forward. I think about David's words on the drive back to my office, and I realize that he's articulated something I've always felt but never quite put into language. The law is a tool, a framework, a set of rules and procedures, but what gives it meaning is the human lives it touches, the stories it helps to resolve, the futures it makes possible. The Keller case wasn't really about cryptocurrency or probate or undue influence. It was about a father who made difficult choices, a son who felt betrayed, a daughter who wanted to be acknowledged, and the messy, painful, beautiful process of figuring out how to move forward. In August, I get invited to the second annual scholarship award ceremony for the Douglas Keller Memorial Scholarship Fund, and I attend along with about 50 other people. Friends, family, former colleagues, and of course, Richard, Maya, and Carmen. This year, the fund is awarding scholarships to 5 students, including one young man named Marcus, who's studying cybersecurity and who gives a moving speech about growing up in foster care and never thinking he'd be able to afford college. He thanks Douglas Keller, whom he never met, for giving him a chance, and he thanks Richard and Maya for creating the fund and believing in students like him. After the ceremony, there's a small reception, and I end up talking to Carmen for the first time since the settlement. She's warm and gracious, thanking me for my work on the case and saying that she knows it must have been hard to fight for Richard while also recognizing Maya's claim. I tell her that's the nature of advocacy, that my job was to represent Richard's interests, but that I always tried to treat everyone involved with respect. She nods and says she appreciated that she knows some attorneys would have tried to destroy her credibility or paint her as a gold digger, and that she's grateful I didn't go that route. Carmen tells me that she and Richard have gotten to know each other over the past year, that they have dinner together sometimes along with Maya, and that she's come to understand his perspective better. She says she wishes Douglas had handled things differently, that he had been honest with Richard from the start, but that she understands why he made the choices he did. She says Douglas was a good man who was trapped between two worlds, trying to honor his marriage and his obligations to Richard while also honoring his love for her and Maya, and that he never quite figured out how to do both. I ask Carmen how she's doing financially, whether the trust is working out for her, and she says yes. That the trustee is managing the funds well, and that she's comfortable. She says she doesn't need much, that she's always lived simply, and that knowing Maya is taken care of and has a relationship with Richard is worth more to her than any amount of money. She says she thinks Douglas would be happy if he could see them now, see how they've created something positive out of his complicated legacy. Before I leave the reception, I take a moment to watch Richard and Maya standing together near the scholarship display, talking to students and answering questions about Douglas and the fund. They look comfortable together, easy, like siblings who've known each other their whole lives rather than strangers who met through a lawsuit. I think about how much work it must have taken to get to this point, how many difficult conversations, how much forgiveness, how much willingness to see past the hurt and the secrets and the betrayals. And I think about my role in all of it, how I fought for Richard, negotiated for him, protected his interests, but also recognized when it was time to settle and move on. I think about how I could have pushed for a trial, could have fought for years over the undue influence claim, could have tried to paint Maya and Carmen as manipulators and schemers, but I didn't, because I could see that Richard's real interest wasn't in winning a legal battle, but in understanding his father and finding a way to live with the truth. And I think that's the art of good lawyering, knowing when to fight and when to settle, when to push and when to pull back, when to focus on the law and when to focus on the people. In September, I write up a case study of the Keller matter for a presentation I'm giving at a family law conference. I change the names and some identifying details, but I keep the essential structure: the surprise will, the secret child, the DNA test, the settlement, the reconciliation. I talk about the legal challenges of the case, the issues of undue influence and testamentary capacity, the complications of cryptocurrency in estate administration. But I also talk about the human dimension, about how the case wasn't really resolved in the courtroom, but in the coffee shops and living rooms where Richard and Maya learned to be siblings. At the conference, after my presentation, several attorneys come up to ask questions and share their own stories of complicated estate cases. One woman tells me about a similar case where two half-siblings fought for years and never reconciled, where the legal fees consumed most of the estate and everyone ended up bitter and broke. Another attorney tells me about a case where the siblings settled quickly, but never spoke to each other again, where the money got divided, but the family stayed broken. They all want to know what made the Keller case different, what allowed Richard and Maya to find their way to each other when so many others don't. I tell them I think it comes down to three things. First, both Richard and Maya were genuinely good people who valued relationships more than money, even if it took them a while to realize it. Second, they had good attorneys who understood that the goal was resolution, not destruction, and who were willing to facilitate settlement even when it meant less in legal fees. And third, they were lucky. Lucky that the settlement happened before too much damage was done. Lucky that neither of them was so angry or hurt that they couldn't imagine forgiveness. Lucky that they found each other when they were both ready to try. But I also tell the other attorneys that luck isn't everything, that we as lawyers have a responsibility to create the conditions for reconciliation when possible, to remind our clients that winning a case isn't always the same as winning in life, and to recognize that sometimes the best outcome is the one that leaves everyone with their dignity and their relationships intact. I tell them that estate litigation is particularly painful because it happens in the context of grief, when people are already vulnerable and raw, and that we need to be sensitive to that emotional dimension even as we focus on the legal issues. The presentation seems to resonate, and afterward, several attorneys tell me that they're going to think differently about their current cases, that they're going to push harder for early settlement discussions and focus more on facilitating communication between family members. One attorney, a woman named Patricia who practices in Vermont, says that she's been stuck in a bitter estate case for 2 years, and that hearing about the Keller case has inspired her to try one more time to bring the parties together. She asks if she can call me if she needs advice, and I give her my card and tell her I'm happy to help. In October, Richard emails me with news that his consulting business has landed a major contract with a tech company in Boston, a deal that will triple his revenue and require him to hire 5 more employees. He says he's excited but also nervous, that he's never managed a team this size before, and he asks if I know any good employment attorneys who can help him navigate the hiring process and draft proper contracts. I send him a few referrals and congratulate him on his success, and I think about how far he's come from that grieving, confused man who sat in my office 18 months ago. I also get a message from Maya, sent through LinkedIn, thanking me again for my work on the case and letting me know that she's been promoted to program director at her nonprofit. She says she's now overseeing a team that helps families navigate the probate process, providing free legal information and emotional support to people dealing with the death of a loved one. She says the work feels meaningful, that she understands from personal experience how overwhelming estate administration can be, and that she's grateful to be able to help others through it. She says that in a way, her father's death and the complicated aftermath gave her a sense of purpose, a direction for her career that she might not have found otherwise. In November, Richard and Maya invite me to Thanksgiving dinner at Richard's condo, and I'm touched by the invitation, but I decline, telling them that I have plans with my own family. They understand, but Maya asks if I'd be willing to meet them for coffee the following week, that there's something they want to discuss with me. I agree. curious about what they might want, and we schedule a meeting for the Monday after Thanksgiving. When we meet at a coffee shop in Concord, Richard and Maya are both there waiting for me, and they seem excited about something. After we order our drinks and sit down, Richard explains that they've been thinking about the scholarship fund and how to grow it, and that they want to ask other wealthy crypto investors to contribute. He says they've drafted a letter explaining Douglas's story and the fund's mission, and they're planning to send it to a list of potential donors. But before they do, they want my legal opinion on whether there are any risks or liabilities they should be aware of, and whether they need to restructure the foundation in any way. I spend the next hour reviewing their plan, asking questions about their donor outreach strategy, their fundraising goals, and their governance structure. I make a few suggestions about compliance and disclosure requirements, and I recommend that they hire a fundraising consultant to help them craft their pitch and identify potential major donors. Richard and Maya listen carefully, taking notes, and by the end of the conversation, they seem confident that they can move forward. They thank me for my time and my continued support, and Richard insists on paying for my coffee despite my protests. As we're leaving the coffee shop, Maya turns to me and says something that catches me off guard. She says that she thinks of me as part of the story now, part of the family history, the person who helped guide them through the darkest part and out the other side. She says that years from now, when she tells her own children about their grandfather Douglas and how she and Richard found each other, she's going to mention me. She's going to talk about the attorney who fought for Richard, but also treated everyone with respect, who helped facilitate a settlement that made reconciliation possible. She says she hopes that doesn't sound weird, but that she wants me to know that my role mattered, that I made a difference. I'm not usually emotional about my cases. I've learned over the years to maintain professional distance, to see myself as an advocate and problem solver rather than as a character in my clients' stories. But something about Maya's words gets to me, maybe because I can see how genuine she is, how much this whole experience has shaped her, and how grateful she is to have found her brother. I tell her thank you, that it's been an honor to be part of their journey, and that I'm proud of both of them for choosing connection over conflict. December comes, and with it the end-of-year push, the rush to close out cases and file paperwork before the holidays. I'm busy with new clients and ongoing matters, but I find myself thinking about the Keller case more often than I usually think about closed files. I think about Richard and Maya and the scholarship fund, about Carmen and her quiet dignity, about Douglas and his impossible choices. I think about how the case taught me something important about my work, about the limits of law and the possibilities of human connection. On the last day of work before Christmas break, I'm cleaning out my office and organizing files when I come across the photo Richard sent me back in June, the one of him and Maya standing in front of the Bedford house. I print it out and put it in a frame, and I set it on my bookshelf next to photos from other memorable cases. A woman I helped win custody of her daughter, a man I represented in a wrongful termination suit, a young couple I helped adopt a child from foster care. These are the cases that remind me why I became a lawyer, the ones where the work mattered not just legally, but humanly. I sit at my desk as the winter light fades outside my window, and I think about all the people I've helped over the years, all the disputes I've resolved, all the problems I've solved. And I think about how the Keller case stands out, not because it was the biggest or the most complex or the most lucrative, but because it was the most human, the most real, the most honest about the messy intersection of love and money and family and grief. I think about Richard's first visit to my office, how angry and lost he was, how certain he was that the will must be a fraud. I think about the moment we opened the safe deposit box and found the will in the letter, about Richard's face going white as he realized his father had kept this massive secret. I think about the DNA test results, about the depositions, about the settlement negotiations where we all tried to find a solution that everyone could live with. And I think about everything that came after. The reconciliation, the scholarship fund, the Thanksgiving dinners, the slow and difficult work of building a relationship out of nothing. The law gave us a framework for resolving the dispute. A set of rules and procedures and concepts like undue influence and testamentary capacity and fiduciary duty. But the law didn't create the reconciliation. That was all Richard and Maya. Their willingness to look past their hurt and their anger, their courage to reach out and try to understand each other, their grace in forgiving their father for his choices, even when those choices caused them pain. My job was to clear the legal obstacles, to negotiate a settlement that gave them both enough that they could move forward without resentment, to create the space where reconciliation became possible. And that, I think, is the real work of a family lawyer, not just to advocate and negotiate and file motions, but to understand that every case is a human story, that behind every dispute is a relationship, and that the best outcomes are the ones that preserve or restore those relationships when possible. Richard and Maya could have fought for years, could have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees, could have destroyed any chance of ever being family. But they didn't, because they made different choices, and because their attorneys helped them see that those choices were available. As I pack up my briefcase and get ready to leave for the holiday, I feel a sense of gratitude for Richard and Maya and the trust they placed in me, for the opportunity to be part of their story, for the reminder that law at its best is a tool for healing and not just for fighting. I feel grateful for this profession, for the privilege of being present at these crucial moments in people's lives, for the chance to make a difference even in small ways. I turn off the lights in my office and head out into the cold December evening, thinking about the year that's ending and the one that's about to begin. I think about the cases I'll handle in the coming months, the clients I'll meet, the problems I'll help solve. And I think about the Keller case, about how it will stay with me, how it will inform the way I approach difficult family disputes, how it will remind me that the goal isn't always to win, but to find a resolution that allows everyone to move forward with their dignity and their humanity intact. As I drive home through the snowy streets of Concord, I think about Richard in his condo in Portsmouth, probably getting ready for Christmas with Maya and Carmen. I think about Maya at her nonprofit, helping other families navigate the probate system and find their way through grief. I think about Carmen in her apartment, comfortable and secure, watching her daughter thrive. And I think about Douglas, whose complicated legacy lives on in the scholarship fund, in the relationship between his children, in the lessons they learned about forgiveness and family, and the choices we make when we think no one is watching. The Keller case taught me that family law isn't really about law at all. It's about people, about the ways we love and hurt each other, about the secrets we keep and the truths we eventually have to confront. It's about the fact that money and property are never just money and property, that they're symbols of love and value and belonging, and that disputes over estates are really disputes over meaning. What did this person's life mean? What did our relationship mean? What do I mean in the story of this family? And it taught me that my job as a lawyer is to help people navigate those questions, not by providing answers, but by creating a process that allows them to find their own answers. Richard didn't need me to tell him whether to forgive his father or whether to build a relationship with Maya. He needed me to resolve the legal dispute so that he had the freedom and the resources to make those choices himself. And that's what I did. And that's what I'll keep doing, case by case, client by client, helping people find their way through the hardest moments of their lives. I pull into my driveway and sit in the car for a moment, watching the snow fall in the glow of the streetlight. I think about all the Christmases to come, all the scholarship award ceremonies, all the Thanksgiving dinners where Richard and Maya will sit together and remember their father and tell stories about the man he was and the choices he made. I think about how those moments wouldn't exist without the work I did, without the settlement I negotiated, without the legal obstacles I cleared away. And I feel proud, not in a boastful way, but in a quiet, satisfied way. The feeling that comes from doing your job well and seeing it matter in someone's life. I gather my things and head inside, ready for the holidays, ready for the new year, ready for whatever cases come next. But I carry the Keller case with me. Carry Richard and Maya's story, carry the lesson that even in the messiest and most painful family disputes, reconciliation is possible if people are brave enough to try, and if their lawyers are wise enough to help them see the way.